in a nutshell, myself, John, Rodney Rivers, Pastor Aussie Cruz from over east side,
yep.
Aboriginal bloke, Pastor Peter Walker,
yes,
all of us, for ever since 1997.
When this began, we have been part of a people's movement. It's got nothing to do with governments or politics, it's grassroots people. We've been part of a people's movement, and the white fellas in that people's movement are all people who can see what was done to your people following the arrival of the English and the horrifying, simply horrifying injustice that occurred. And we might be wrong, but we have a deep-seated conviction that after 240 years now, that's dated since Cook, not since the first fleet in 1788, but dated since Cook's in 1770, your people are suffering the consequences every single day. You know the story so much more than I know it. But we can see that that is the truth. And we've reached a conclusion. This, as I hope I was clear enough, it's led by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And sitting down together, we've reached the conclusion that if it hasn't been resolved in 240 years and the consequences are still going on, that means something's missing. Something is terribly wrong. And the conclusion that we've reached is that the only way, in our opinion, the only way that we are ever going to see justice and maybe some level of healing happen will be if we can capture the support of the Australian public. We don't see any initiatives, solutions, call it what we will, having much strength if it doesn't have the support of the wider Australian public behind it. So in a nutshell, we're on a mission to try to capture the support of the Australian public. And how would you do that becomes the next question. And our answer to that is, in our view, the only way we will ever see the support of the Australian public for a lot of the issues and understanding that's needed in terms of what happened and the consequences, is if the Australian public are better educated with regard to what actually happened. There's 23 million people living in this country, and hardly any of them know what actually happened right back at the start that's caused the consequences that we still see now. And because that hardly any of them have much understanding of what happened, hardly any of them care much. I'm sure you know that yourselves. The broad Australian public, they know the issues are there, but they're not about to lift a finger to do much about it. And we feel, it's very, very deeply, we have this conviction that if we're ever going to change the attitudes of people, then we've got to get them better educated. So, that brings me to the start of the story.
So that was saying this.
Aussie Cruz, myself, John here, others, Peter Walker, we began to ask the question, are there any documents anywhere that we could get hold of that would help us to explain to the Australian public the true story of what happened? And so we went in search of any early records we could find. And we found something. We found the logbook that was on the H.M. Bark and Never, mastered by James Cook. And the logbook had a lot of entries, but we picked out just two. The first was, Cook wrote in his own hand, and so did his offsider Banks, that when the ship dropped anchor in Botany Bay on the 28th of April 1770, and that's 240 odd years ago, only 15 minutes elapsed before Cook was the first to go for his gun and start shooting his way ashore amongst your people.
Yeah, that's right.
Just 15 minutes. I sit here as a descendant of these people, and I sit with you utterly grief-stricken that my ancestors behaved like that toward your ancestors. No sitting back and waiting for invitation. No one or two people going forward to try to make some sort of contact or dialogue. But a crew of 30 or 40 start going for their guns. Not in a week, not even in a day, but within less than an hour. Horrifying. Utterly horrifying. And when they blasted their way ashore, they didn't stop with that. They then went up into the village that was on the rise and started poking through the houses and uncovering children that were hidden under shields. It was day one of the invasion. That record you got there, it marks day one of the invasion. And it's so short and so clear, it's just like somebody stood there and went click with a camera and captured what happened, written right on that single page. So we found a record of what happened. The second one we found was to do with the land. And this one records that Cook wrote in his journal that on the day he took possession of the Australian coast, east coast, in the name of his King of England, on the same day he recorded he knew the land was already inhabited. When I join up the dots and just reflect a little bit on the seriousness of what we're looking at, it was a recipe for disaster. And disaster is what we've had from that day to this. 240 years of a people deprived and marginalised in their own country. That's what it's led to. And if that's not a disaster, then I need somebody to explain to me what a disaster is. So, all of us, Ozzy and myself, the rest of us, we found a couple of records that are the earliest in existence that describe what happened and start to teach us how the past caused the present. There's 23 million people in this country, and you would not find 100,000 who know these records exist. And we're on a mission to change that. We might be naive, but all the people we've talked to so far, when they see these two records, these two pages, they are utterly shocked to think that it all happened as blatantly as that. We want to gather the nation together. We want to gather the whole population, or invite the whole population to gather together in what will be an historic assembly of the people of Australia and gather them together at that site of that first encounter at Botany Bay. And there we want to do a few things. We want to have the Australian public start to address the causes of what happened instead of forever mucking about with the symptoms. We want to stand there at that site and publicly take the forced entry into the villages that day and publicly denounce that forced entry. Declare it totally unacceptable to us now, and by that means overturn it. And then we want to take this second one, the lie that was spoken over the land that described it or declared it a land belonging to no one, and we want to name it for what it was. It was a lie. It was never true. And these records prove that the people were here and that they knew they were here on the first day. And we want to take that lie that was spoken over the land, and if you can picture 100,000 people, maybe a lot more, who knows, standing there together, making this public declaration, it'll be impossible to hide that from the eyes of the whole nation. But my betting is, with 100,000 people standing there at that site, making this declaration as the public of Australia, it will be impossible to hide it from the eyes of the whole world. Every camera in every country will be trained on us as the Australians take this journey. We want to take the lie that was spoken over the land and declare it for what it was, a lie. The truth is that there were people in this land who owned this land. Yeah. And we want to denounce the lie that was spoken over the land and declare it totally unacceptable to us, what happened, and by that means publicly overturn it. All of that will be displayed, if you like, portrayed to the eyes of the world under a huge banner. This is a national act of recognition of the first peoples of this land, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And on this day, we, the public of Australia, begin to restore the recognition and the respect and the human dignity that was denied 240 years ago. On this day, we begin to address the cause of what happened that brought so much grief, instead of forever mucking about with the symptoms. And see where God takes us with that step faithfully executed.
So I'm just thinking, would that, what about the churches? Would the churches then lead that, or
it's a people's movement, but it's Christ-led. It's a Christ-led, a Christian-led people's movement, but it's totally inclusive. People don't have to believe what I believe to be part of it. People don't have to believe anything to be part of it. They only have to be people who want to see justice and healing. But to answer your question, the churches, yes, it's a people's movement, but it's Jesus-led. It's not politically led, it's not government-led or any of that stuff. That map I've got there to illustrate what we mean. It's a grassroots movement. We've been building this from the bottom up instead of the top down. We have been going to folk like you all over Australia for about 5 years now, explaining ourselves in communities, explaining what we are wanting to do, but explaining also that we will only go ahead if we have the approval of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We will only invite the Australian public to assemble in this historic assembly if your people all over Australia give us permission to do it. And in that sense, we have been building from the bottom up instead of the top down. And that's why I've come to you, to explain ourselves and seek your approval to gather the whole nation together. So, answering your question from just a slightly different angle, you can see from what I've described that we are coming to you guys first. We haven't even been to the churches all that much. We have to some extent. Quite frankly, the majority of them seem to be asleep at the wheel. They just don't seem to have the fire in the belly to move and act instead of just sit and talk. So we want to act. We want to gather the nation together, but we will only do so with your approval, with your authority, and something a bit deeper, we need your blessing.